Question number 1, Honourable Annette King.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. How many times this year and on what dates has he had communications with Cameron Slater?
Honourable Stephen Joyce on behalf of the Prime Minister.
On behalf of the Prime Minister, my office has gone through my diary and there is no record of any meetings with Mr Slater. However, in my capacity as Prime Minister, I attend a large number of events and it is possible Mr Slater may have been at one or more of those. Over the course of the year, to the best of my recollection, my contact with Mr Slater has not been in my capacity as Prime Minister except for on the following 3 occasions. Number 1, I wrote to Mr Slater on the 7th of November in relation to his privacy complaint. Number 2, on Monday night I received an unsolicited text message from Mr Slater and there was a brief exchange of texts which have been publicly released. And number 3, yesterday I communicated with Mr Slater asking him to forward me his copies of the text messages so they could be publicly released.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Given he said in September that, quote, I took the liberty of changing my phone number, end quote, when he gave his new number to Cameron Slater, did he expect to maintain personal communications with him?
Honourable Stephen Joyce on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, my understanding is that he updated his number to virtually all his media contacts and didn't give any thought as to the likelihood of seeking to receive communications from them or not.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Why did he tell journalists on Tuesday that Cameron Slater had, quote, sent me a text one time but I can't remember when that was, end quote, when he had engaged in text conversation with Mr Slater the night before?
Honourable Stephen Joyce on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, he's actually addressed that matter with the media today. He acknowledged with them that he could have been more specific. At that stage, he was... Well,
Order!
I don't think I've ever seen
Order.
But at that stage, he was late to get to the House. In fact, members may recall it was on Tuesday and actually arrived at the House and opposition members were berating him for being late and arriving after the prayer. So he was very aware that he was late. He'd been answering questions in relation to the Chisholm report and he also assumed that that was what the question related to.
Well, supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Is the Jason referred to in his conversation with Cameron Slater on the 24th of November one Jason Eade? And doesn't this level of cosiness demonstrate that he, Mr Slater and Mr Eade are in close contact?
Honourable Stephen Joyce on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I think he's known to refer to most people by their first names and it doesn't apply any particular level of endearment.
Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Can he assure this House that the conversation he had with Cameron Slater on the 24th of November that he published last night is complete and unedited?
Honourable Stephen Joyce on behalf of the Prime Minister.
On behalf of the Prime Minister, I understand that's indeed correct.
Thank you. Supplementary question,
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Did he delete text messages from Cameron Slater which he received on the 24th of November from his ministerial phone?
Honourable Stephen Joyce on behalf of the Prime Minister.
On behalf of the Prime Minister, I'm not sure whether it was his ministerial phone, but he definitely deletes all his text messages in case his phone is lost at any stage. And that's why he contacted Mr Slater to ask them to be provided if he had them so that he could release them to the media.
How does he lie straight in bed?
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Is the reason he has tried to cover up his relationship with Cameron Slater is because it shows that he, his office, his staff and his blogger are engaged in operating one of the most vile smear machines this country has ever seen?
Order. Honourable Stephen Joyce on behalf of
on behalf of the Prime Minister, I think Annette's borrowed Andy Little's lines this afternoon. A little angry.
Order. I don't need assistance. Could the Minister, in responding, address members of the House properly? It is not appropriate to address members simply by their Christian name. Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr Speaker, as I was saying, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I think Annette King has borrowed Mr Little's lines for today. But in relation to... No, they're not the truth at all. They're not the truth at all. If there's ever been a vile machine on the 9th floor, it was when that member was in government and it was under Helen Clark and when Grant Robertson was in the Leader's office.
Running back ops.
Right, order. Question.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question. Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In reference to his answer to the primary question, what exactly was it about the nature of the text messages that have been published and which the Prime Minister has acknowledged he received as the Prime Minister that defined them that he was acting in his role as Prime Minister rather than leader of the National Party when he received and exchanged those texts with Cameron Slater?
Honourable Stephen Joyce on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I would say that would be because of the nature of the report that was under discussion. The member will recall that Phil Goff had leaked the report. That's right. Had leaked the report. It was under discussion because Phil Goff had leaked it to the media on the Monday, so it was being discussed up and down the country. And I am assuming that that's possibly why Mr Slater texted the Prime Minister.
That's right.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question. Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In light of the Prime Minister's statement that he deletes all the other text messages he got from Mr Slater, how can he be confident that none of those text messages, considered material which would be in relation to his role as Prime Minister, and hence should have been listed in answer to the primary question?
Honourable Stephen Joyce on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, he is confident on that in relation to the subject matter discussed.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question. Dr. Russell Norman.
How can he be confident on it when he has deleted all the text messages? How does he know what the content was of all those text messages? Does he remember them all?
Order. Honourable Stephen Joyce on behalf
of the Prime Minister, I'm assuming he remembers the content of the conversations.
How many questions? Sorry, question.
Order. Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston.
Can the Minister confirm that as early as the 23rd of October, Mr Cameron Slater was leaking parts of this report?
Sorry.
One more time. Can he confirm? Well, he said he couldn't hear me.
It only needs to be stated once, I'm sure. The Minister's heard the question. Unless the Minister did not...
Sorry, Mr Speaker, I actually didn't hear it.
Then I apologise to both members.
There was just a bit at the end I couldn't hear.
Order. Would the Right Honourable Winston Peters repeat the question?
Can he confirm that as early as the 23rd of October, parts of that report were being leaked by Cameron Slater?
Order. Honourable Stephen Joyce on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I'm not sure what ministerial responsibility there would be, but I figure I can confirm no is the answer to the question.
Question number 2.